Hi, and welcome to Real Estate Today. My name is Ed Cox, and my co-host is Maria Babicki. We come to you from our home offices instead of the Simsbury Community Television Studio, where we have good coaching from Karen Hanville, usually in the off to the side, coaching us through this. So Karen Hanville, the station manager at Simsbury Community Television, has graciously offered to put this show together for us. And hopefully we don't disappoint. Anyway, we have a great show planned for you today. We have a guest. Her name is Maryellen DiLuzio, and she is the owner and lab director at Envirotech Lab in Windsor, Connecticut. And they do a lot of water testing. And in fact, if you've purchased a home recently, your water was probably tested by Envirotech, because a lot of our local home inspectors bring their water samples there to be tested. So really where this all got started was Maria was having her water tested, and she had a tremendous conversation with Maryellen. And she thought that it would be a perfect opportunity to have a show about it. There's a lot more to water than just turning on the faucet and drinking out of it, which I have done for the past 30 years and just took for granted that my water is good. So there's an industry about testing, and there's a lot to know, and that's where we get started right now. So Maria, if you could get our questions started, and welcome Maryellen DiLuzio.
Hi, Maryellen. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Why don't we begin by having you tell us about yourself and how you became involved in water testing?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Of course, I always love talking about my favorite topic, water testing and water quality. Well, I went to college at University of New England, and I graduated with a degree in environmental science and chemistry. So I was very interested in the environmental field and everything to do with water in general. So I first was hired as a lab tech here at Envirotech Lab, and eventually became lab director, and then eventually owner. And I've been here ever since performing water testing. So I'm a small lab located in Windsor. I've been in business for over 35 years, done thousands and thousands of water tests in the area, and have pretty good feel for the water quality in Connecticut in general, and in Western Massachusetts as well. I'm a certified public health laboratory by the Department of Public Health here in Connecticut, and I'm also an EPA certified lab.
Okay. A common question we have is preferences between well water and public water. Can you tell us your thoughts on that? How do they compare?
Well, obviously the most important thing about any kind of water is whether or not it's safe for drinking. And certainly public water supplies work very hard, to have their water maintain a good quality and to be safe for drinking. They're very heavily regulated and overseen by the state health department. And then there's private residential water wells, which also are excellent sources of water. Our well drillers here in Connecticut are excellent, and they can provide very good, stable drinking water for homes. So it's a matter of personal preference. Usually if you have well water, it's because there is no public water supply available in your area. If there is, you are required by state law to hook up to that public water supply, so you don't have a choice. If you are in an area for the MDC or Connecticut Water Company, you have to attach to their water supply. If you're in a more rural area, more rural area of Simsbury and some of our other towns where there is no public water supply, then you go with a private well. And generally, they're good.
Would that mean you'd have to attach immediately, or if your well became problematic, then at that point would you have to attach?
Right. So if you already had an existing private well and then the public water supply came through, you have an option to hook up at that time. You don't have to. You can stay with your private well. But if something happened to your well and you needed to hook up to the city water, you could do that later, and it's usually more expensive to do it at that time.
Yeah.
But a lot of people like their private wells because they like the taste of it. They like not having the water bill. And as long as you've got a good, adequate yield and good quality, you can stay with your private well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can you tell by looking at water, just by visually looking at it, if it's public water or well water?
No. In general, no. If they're similar in water quality, usually a visual difference between well water is if it was something that had a very high iron content or discoloration. You usually aren't going to see anything like that with a public water supply. But if you have good, clean, clear well water, you're not going to be able to visually see a difference. You might smell a difference because the public water supplies are chlorinated. So you might often detect that residual chlorine in your water.
What's added to the public water?
Well, obviously they chlorinate to keep the water sterilized and clean and free of harmful bacteria, and they have to do that. And then a lot of times they'll add additives for anti-corrosion, and that's all for reducing potential of lead in your water or other harmful metals that might get leached from the plumbing systems.
So you could still use a water treatment system with public water?
Yes, because actually some public water supplies are on the hard side, and people might not like that. Also, I would recommend that you do remove the residual chlorine from your drinking water before you drink it. And that could be as simple as filling some up in a container and just letting the chlorine naturally dissipate. Or you can get a simple filter to take it out.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So if somebody wanted to test their water, would they contact you directly?
They can contact me directly, absolutely. And it's a very simple procedure. We like to supply people with the sampling containers because they are sterilized for the bacteria part of the test. And then if you do a more extensive analysis, you'll have things like glass vials with preservative in them or other containers. And we'll give you the instructions. We'll go over that with you. You can fill the sample yourself and bring it back to the lab. We provide you with a chain of custody or information sheet that you fill out that provides us with the information that we need, basically where the sample was collected from, the date and time, what tests you want to perform, and who you'd like us to send a copy of the report to. The only time you couldn't do that is if you was a brand new well. In certain health districts, they require the laboratory to collect the water sample. So at that point, you'd have to arrange with us a time for us to come out and get the sample. Yeah. And
what is the state of Connecticut? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to go into some of the requirements.
Yeah. What does the state of Connecticut require for well testing? How often should it be done?
Well, for private well water, there's no absolute requirement that you have to have your private well tested every so often. The only time it's required by law to analyze your well water is when the well is first drilled. And you're either getting a certificate of occupancy for your house or you're just replacing an existing well. At that point, you're required by law to analyze the water. Other than that, the only other time you're required to analyze your water is during a real estate transaction. And you should check it prior to purchasing the home. It is recommended by the state health department that everybody with private wells do at least the basic, what's called potability test, which is a general chemical and bacteriological analysis once a year. Another time you should also have your water tested is if you ever detect a change in water quality. So if you get a sudden note or discoloration, something like that, that indicates something's changed, then you want to have your water tested at that time.
What's the turnaround time for having water testing?
We generally get most tests done within 2 working days. So
okay.
We specialize in private well water, and we do a lot for real estate transactions, and we realize that there's always a time crunch in that case. So we try and get it done as quickly as possible. So the basic potability test we do sometimes in less than 2 working days. Another thing that the state recommends and most people will do prior to purchasing a home, besides the basic potability, would be radon in water, arsenic and uranium, which are all naturally occurring. with radon being the most common.
Okay. If you have a vacant home, how long would you recommend the water be run before the test?
Yeah, this is a little tricky area. And we're not running into that as often, but when there were more foreclosures on the market, houses have been sitting for months and months. If it's only been sitting for a few weeks, it's not a big issue. But once you start getting beyond a couple months or 6 months, then a minimum, I would suggest an hour of flushing that well. And if you can do more than that, that's even better. What you'd like to see is that your pump has turned on several times and has cycled through. So you get to the point where you're pumping fresh groundwater. You want to get the aquifer moving and really rid any water that's been sitting in the well column or in all the piping in the house so that you're testing fresh groundwater. And so it depends on a lot of factors, how often you should run it or how long, because of depending on how deep the well is and what the yield is, how long it's sat. But I would say a minimum an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any generalities we can say about water in Simsbury?
In Simsbury, generally, it's good water quality there. Occasionally, we might find some hard water. Occasionally, we might find some radon, but it's not known as a hot spot for anything or a problem area. Yep.
What are some hot spots for different items in water?
A town like Glastonbury is known as a hot spot for radon and uranium. And some of the highest radon and uranium levels I've seen have come from that town, and it's widespread and much more common than, say, for an example, where we've seen it also in Summers, some uranium, but that's more and not as widespread throughout the town. We've also found uranium out in the Stafford area. And then you can get into certain areas like West Suffield, and certain streets are known to have extremely hard water. Also a town like Stafford, it's not surprising if you run into really high iron contents. The same is true for Tolland and Colchester. So you have issues like that in certain areas. Everything's treatable though. So if there is a problem that comes up, there are water treatment dealers around that can pretty much correct anything and get that to good, clean water.
Okay. Is a deeper well a better well?
Not necessarily. Sometimes the deeper you go, when you start getting to 400, 500, 600 feet, you tend to run into more minerals in the water. So you have a greater chance of getting really hard water and iron and manganese and things like that. The shallower wells can have that as well, but they tend not to have as much.
I noticed when I changed my canister filter in my, that the filter is kind of got a reddish brown kind of characteristic to it.
Right.
What would that be?
Part of that's iron and other natural minerals that are just present due to the geology of your area. And it's the same thing for whether or not you have radon, arsenic, or uranium. It just depends on the geology of the area where your well is drilled. And in the Northeast, we do have that issue. It's just in the rock, the radon and uranium. Not as much arsenic as in other states like New Hampshire and Maine.
Okay. When we spoke before the show, you told us we had a little conversation about emerging contaminants. Could we discuss that?
Yes. And when we say emerging contaminants, these are some of the new problems that we started to become aware with. And a couple of years ago, that was uranium. And within the last year or so, especially in the area of the laboratory here in Windsor, one of the emerging contaminants are called PFOAs. And those were the chemicals that are used in fire retardants. They're also used in the making of fire retardant material and Teflon and ski wax and a variety of different areas. As far as I know, we don't have one of those manufacturers in the state. So fortunately, we don't have a widespread problem with those chemicals to date where they've been found is near the airports, so near Bradley Field and then near Tweed in New Haven. There are states like New Hampshire where they do have a manufacturing company and they have more of a widespread problem with those particular chemicals. They're highly toxic and they require a very low detection level. And the state is now doing more and more testing for that to just see how widespread it is. We have, in the probably dozen or so samples that we've done for those particular chemicals, we haven't found any yet.
But these chemicals go into the river and things like that too?
Well, if there's a spill, and they would, in Connecticut, that's probably how they would mostly enter the groundwater, was through an accidental spill or use of a fire retardant material near the airports. In a place like New Hampshire, where they have a manufacturing company that uses these chemicals, because I believe they manufacture fire retardant cloth for furniture and things like that. They have emissions from of PFOAs, and they have found through those emissions that it has spread as far as 50 miles away from the plants, and then it rains, and those chemicals enter the ground and into the groundwater. But in Connecticut, as far as we know now, we wouldn't have that issue.
Okay.
So it would have to come from some outside chemical spill, that sort of thing.
Okay. You used a word a little bit ago. You said aquaphors. Can you just define some terms that we hear commonly, like aquaphors, groundwater, artesian wells, water tables, things like that? What is it all mean?
Sure. The aquifer is basically your underground water source. Mm-hmm. So within the, we have the topsoil, and then beneath that is what you might refer to as our ledge or our rock that is underneath the ground there. And that is what your well is drilled into. In those rocks are little cracks and fissures where water travels and lives. So it rains, it filters down through the topsoil into the cracks and fissures of the ledge. And when you drill your well, you're drilling into those areas where those cracks and fissures are carrying a water supply, and that fills up your well. So say, for example, you're drilling a well and it's 300 feet deep. The well driller, when he's drilling the well, he'll be telling you what kind of rock he's drilling through. And then a lot of times they can tell at what levels the water is coming in and at what quantity, the gallons per minute. So they might start to drill your well, and maybe at 150 feet, they'll hit a gallon a minute of water, and then they decide that's not enough, and that's not an adequate supply, and they'll keep drilling until they reach what would be considered an adequate supply for your house. So I'd say most wells are at least 350 feet today. And that's called the aquifer, all those fissures and spaces in the rock that contain the water. And generally your aquifer around your home is recharged from the ground within about a space of 5 acres around where your well is drilled. So if you do have well water, it is important what you use on your lawn and what's used in your area, because it might affect your water quality. Then what the well drillers do is the part that goes through the topsoil, they line with a casing, and the casing is sealed off, so no surface water can enter into your well, and then your well fills up with water. And when it fills up with water, it rises to a certain level within that water column. And that level is called your static level. You might hear well drillers or plumbers and pump people talk about the static level. And that's where your water naturally rises and rests. But when they drill the well, if that static level rises and spills over the top of your well, so you have water always coming out of the top of your well, that's what's considered a true artesian well. Mm-hmm. And it's overflows like that. It can actually be a little bit of a nuisance because now you have all this extra water you have to deal with and remove from your property. Mm-hmm. The water table is the level at which if you were to dig from the surface down into the ground, where you start to see the groundwater accumulating, where it's wet. And in areas where you have springs that come up to the surface, that's basically the aquifer, which rises to the surface of the ground. And those can be excellent sources of water. But you have to obviously construct a well around that is sanitary and prevents surface water from leaking into it. But the groundwater table, you've heard of things like it being high and being low, but that all eventually sifts down into the aquifer and influences that. So when the water tables shift, sometimes people experience a water quality change as well. So when we are in periods of drought, the groundwater level really drops. And when we're in areas of normal rain or excess rain, then the groundwater tables can really rise. And during those times, people can experience a change in water quality. Some people get odors, some people get discolorations, and the taste of the water might change. And that's when you would probably want to do another water test to make sure that everything stayed safe for drinking.
Okay. And what's a decent amount of gallons per minute for a well to produce?
Yeah, I think that there are all kinds of building codes which regulate the minimums yield for wells under new construction. And of course, it depends on the size of the house as well. But I believe they want a minimum of 4 gallons per minute for the yield on a well. Yep.
All right.
Yep. And then if you're going to use your well for other things like irrigation, watering your lawn, you might want a greater yield than that. Yep.
Okay. So some of the nuisance things that might be in well water, like iron, hard water, how do you treat those?
Well, there are different approaches depending on the general water quality, because other things that will influence what kind of treatment you get are what the pH levels are, what your hardness levels are. Then you'll look at your iron and manganese as well, which can cause staining. And depending on the relationships of those will lead you in a certain direction of what type of water treatment you want to go for. The most common choice is a water softener, and they do very well because it removes not only hardness, but it will also take out your iron and manganese. But it works by a process of ion exchange. So it's going to take out the hardness, which is a total of calcium and magnesium in your water. It'll take out the hardness, the iron and the manganese, but in its place, it's going to put sodium. So you will have an elevated sodium content your sodium content will be higher after you add a water softener. And then with the water treatment system, those units have to back flush. And they have a salty, brackish brine water that needs to be disposed of. And the proper health code is for those to go into its own separate sort of little leach field to dispose of the water properly and away from your well, so that you don't eventually even add more salt to your well. So a water softener is very common. You can also get iron removal systems designed specifically for removing iron. If you have a low pH, they have a pH neutralizing system. And if you have the pH neutralizing systems, all these treatment systems go on after your pressure tank in the basement. So your whole house water is treated. And that would actually add some calcium to your water to bring the pH up and be less corrosive. If you had something different like nitrates from fertilizer or any metal like lead or arsenic or uranium, then the most common form of treatment is a point of use system at the kitchen sink. And there you would have a separate tap for your cooking and drinking water, and you would have separate filters for taking those out.
Okay.
It also takes out sodium.
All right. A common one we hear about is Brita. Like, what is that actually doing?
Yeah, well, the Brita filters are great, and they really help with the taste of the water. And I think the most primarily they're there to help take out some of the residual chlorine in the public water supplies. I've never looked at and read the labels really closely, but if you were considering any kind of filter for a particular problem, make sure you read the labels and that it does address your concerns on that label. Yep.
Okay.
And when you invest in a treatment system, you want to make sure that it's going to take care of the problem that you're trying to address. If you're reading on the internet and it seems a little bit too good to be true, it probably is. If you have something, tricky or really has major health effects like lead and arsenic and uranium or even radon, you don't want to take the approach of one of these quick counter type of fixes. You really want to invest on something that's going to give you a long-term stable water quality.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know when I had my water tested, you deemed that it was extremely hard. And on my shower glass, I see marks on it that are really tough to remove.
Yes.
And also around the faucets, it's kind of a challenge as well.
Right. That's one of the side effects of hard water, which is the calcium and magnesium. It's scale forming. And you get that buildup, and that buildup is also occurring on the inside of your pipes as well. And over time, it can really restrict flow, and then you get into larger issues of maybe having to replace some piping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how do you test for that? How do you test for the scaling?
Well, when we check your water, one of the tests we do is hardness.
Oh, I see.
So we'll give you a hardness level, and then we'll tell you you could be getting scaling. And the scaling happens over long term. There's lots of different things that affect how quickly or if it scales at all. It may not scale that bad. It depends on a lot of other qualities of the water. But I can't tell you if it's happened in your pipes. The only way to know is to actually, have a plumber check them and see if scaling has happened in there.
Okay.
I know another test that you perform is organic material. I know that we've had to treat wells with bleach, what, E. coli or? Right.
So the bleach treatment or sterilization treatment would be if you had bacteria in your water.
Bacteria.
And that's a standard remedy and it works very well. Some people with well water every spring automatically chlorinate their wells as sort of a standard maintenance procedure. Yeah.
I know that is one of the things in real estate that we get a water test back and that comes up as a positive. Sometimes it also requires a change in the cap on the well, makes it more airtight, I guess.
Right. Yes. I mean, some of the wells that are existing out there, the well caps would not meet current health code. And still you do run across well caps that are below ground, which wouldn't meet current health code. And they're grandfathered in. And if the water test comes out fine, that's fine too. But at some point, you might want to consider bringing those kind of well caps up to current health code.
That's exactly what a transaction that Maria and I are in the process of right now. The well cap was below grade.
Yep.
It was a shallow well. It wasn't producing enough water. So we ended up an entire new well was drilled.
Yeah.
And it took quite a bit of machinery and stuff to drill. I think that was almost a 300-foot well that ended up, the other one was quite shallow.
Yeah, the well drilling process is really fascinating to watch. I mean, what they do, and that machine that drilling rig that they bring in is really something.
Yeah.
And how it works. And so now, that's an investment in their house, and it's well worth doing. Now they have a good, probably stable well water supply.
Production of the well was, after they did it, was, I mean, an amazing number, 20 gallons or something. They were really pleased. They were really pleased with it. Yeah, that was
Yeah,
really pleased with. So I do recall when I was talking to the well man, he was saying he was using they had drilled a well a couple doors down, and he knew how deep that well was, and it was sort of level. So he was using that sort of to make his estimate, even though he wasn't sure that it would be the same. So now on my street, I live kind of on a hill, and each of our wells, I believe, are much different in depth. And would we be getting the same water from our next door neighbor? Would our wells be, like, if they did a water test there, would we be getting a similar result?
I would say chances are yes, but there's no guarantee. We definitely have seen differences in neighbors and even across the street. A while back when there was the big contamination with EDB, ethylene dibromide, that was used on tobacco fields in East Windsor, Enfield, and out in Summers area, parts of Suffield, big tobacco growing areas. It was interesting to check houses all along the street, and we would find one house with EDB and a house on either side would be fine. So it told you a lot about the aquifer, that obviously that one house was in a different part of the aquifer than the houses on either side. So same thing with radon. You can, if your well happens to be near the radon source, you're the one that's going to have radon and your neighbor may not.
Yes.
And you can also have radon in your water and not have it high in the home, and vice versa.
Yeah. I think we've had every circumstance possible with that.
Yeah. Yep. I'm sure you've run into a lot of that over the years with the different homes.
Well, our half hour went by in a flash.
Wow, it did. Yeah.
Yeah. So we would just like to thank you again for coming and joining us on the show. It's been really interesting hearing about this. Half hour isn't nearly enough to cover all the topics. But thank you for joining us. And we would also like to thank our viewers for tuning in today. So,
well, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, you're welcome. I hope you could join us again sometime in the future.
Yeah,
I'll be bringing my water to your place.
I'll be waiting.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.